everybody. It is Thursday, July 18th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to.
Moshe, late night at the Republican National Convention.
Yeah, our big introduction to the new vice presidential nominee on the Republican side, J.D. Vance. Fun fact, if elected, he would be the third youngest VP in history. Richard Nixon is the second youngest. He's a name you would be familiar with when he was Eisenhower's VP. He was only 40 years old in a few days. And the youngest ever, a guy named John Breckinridge. He ran against Abe Lincoln, was the VP under Buchanan, one of our worst presidents. So I could go on about John Breckinridge. But Jill, I imagine people want to hear about this century, not 2 centuries ago.
Save that for the premium feed, Moshe.
John Breckinridge, youngest VP ever, part of the ticket that led this nation into a civil war.
Thanks for nothing, John Breckinridge.
Yeah, so higher hopes for J.D. Vance.
Okay, here are the headlines. Introducing J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee, taking center stage at the Republican National Convention, introducing himself to the American people. Plus, what to expect from a potential second Trump term. The former president sits down with Bloomberg Business Week and lays out some of his economic ideas. To the Democrats, another big name on the Democratic side is calling on President Biden to drop out of the race, as polls show which Democratic names would do best against Donald Trump in the general election. Spoiler alert, it is not Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. And Moshe, it comes as we're learning that Biden himself will be off the campaign trail for a while. He has tested positive for COVID-19. Meanwhile, with rents and housing costs continuing to climb, Biden is out with a plan to cap rent hikes. In other news, Alec Baldwin is looking to now file a lawsuit against prosecutors after his criminal case was dismissed last week. And all of this heat is creating major problems on the nation's rails. We'll look at delays at Amtrak, and is there a possible solution? Plus, the Emmy nominations are out. We've got the snubs and the surprises. And speaking of surprises, Adele announces that she's taking a big break from music. We'll tell you why. Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill, as we talk about conventions this week, we take you to one convention past. And a little-known law professor puts out a book called Dreams from My Father. That author would go on to become president just a few years later.
Too easy, Moshe. These are not teases. They're just
well, I was doing them. They were too hard. Now they're too easy.
They were too hard.
We'll get it just right for you tomorrow.
Okay, let's start with the Republican National Convention, where much of America got their first introduction to Donald Trump's vice presidential pick, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, who delivered the primetime convention speech on Wednesday night. Vance himself is new to the political game. He has only been in elected politics in the U.S. Senate for 18 months. He's never attended a national political convention before this year. The author turned venture capitalist turned politician is currently 39 years old. He turns 40 next month. He could be the third youngest vice president in American history. In his speech last night, he spent time introducing himself to the American people, talking about his personal story, his upbringing in a poor family that wrestled with drug addiction. Vance also talked about his military background. He is a former Marine and the first post 9/11 veteran to run on a major party ticket.
So Vance used his first major national address at the RNC convention to accept the nomination and really highlight his personal story, including his upbringing in a poor family that struggled with addiction. He actually took a moment last night in the speech to highlight his mother in the crowd, who's been sober for about 10 years, saying that she will be able to celebrate her next anniversary of being sober at the White House. He tried to make the case that his party, the Republicans, best understand the challenges facing struggling Americans. Remember, Vance is from Ohio. He became famous writing the book Hillbilly Elegy about his family's struggles. But he made clear that he's going to use his background, his life story, to connect with blue-collar voters in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, really a number of battleground states where they feel they've been able to flip the state of the party. As it wasn't very long ago that the Democrats were the blue-collar union party, the Republicans viewed as elites, and they were really trying to flip it tonight at the Republican National Convention. Having attended a number of these, to hear Republicans criticizing the war in Iraq, criticizing Wall Street, that wasn't the Republican Party of just 10 years ago. Vance made a point of saying, "I will be a vice president who never forgets where he came from." He praised Trump a number of times during the speech, noting that it's Trump who's in touch with the average American, and really painted President Biden as a symbol of what he called corrupt Washington insiders who've exploited America. Take a listen to a bit of it.
Friends, things did not work out well for a lot of kids I grew up with. Every now and then, I will get a call from a relative back home who asks, "Did you know so-and-so?" And I'll remember a face from years ago, and then I'll hear, "They died of an overdose." As always, America's ruling class wrote the checks. Communities like mine paid the price. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, a small town where people spoke their minds, built with their hands, and loved their God, their family, their community, and their country with their whole hearts. But it was also a place that had been cast aside and forgotten by America's ruling class in Washington. When I was in the 4th grade, a career politician by the name of Joe Biden supported NAFTA, a bad trade deal that sent countless good jobs to Mexico.
And this riff here goes on and on about Biden, including attacking Biden for supporting other free trade measures, supporting the war in Iraq. Again, pretty remarkable that we're just 20 years ago, after President George W. Bush invaded Iraq, the 2004 Republican convention was all rah-rah about that. The party has completely reversed itself. And what you got last night was a reinforcement from Vance and others of a more isolationist, more pro-tariff, less free trade Republican Party. Vance previewed his role here as the attack dog, spending a lot of time not only telling his own story, but then shifting to President Biden, calling him a politician in Washington for longer than I've been alive. Note, Vance is 39 years old, turning 40 next month. Note that Joe Biden has been in Washington for nearly 50 years. We also got an introduction to the future potential second lady, Usha Vance. She's of an Indian background. She gave the speech introducing J.D. Vance. She framed him as a powerful example of the American dream, a boy from Ohio raised by his grandmother, chosen to help lead our country through some great challenges. There was a moment last night where Vance spoke to his kids, who he said were in the hotel room, saying it was past time for them to go to bed. He spoke past 10 p.m. Central Time there in Milwaukee. Beyond Vance, we heard a number of themes last night as the Republican Party tries to reach as many demographics as possible. You had Texas Governor Abbott, who gave a speech boasting about busing migrants to sanctuary cities, doubling down on razor wire installations. A lot of border talk last night. Notably, a number of people in the crowd had signs that read "mass deportation now" and "send them back." Remember that there's about 10 to 12 million undocumented migrants here in the U.S. This is an issue that has resonated a lot, not only for Republicans, also independents and Democrats. We've talked about it a lot on this podcast. Here's a bit of Texas Governor Abbott last night.
He will arrest the criminal illegal immigrants and put them behind bars. Or send them back.
They also made a point of reaching out to veterans last night. One of the more powerful moments, they had a number of members of 13 Gold Star families, parents and family members of servicemen and women killed in that suicide bombing in Kabul back in 2021. You might remember during that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was a suicide bombing at the airport. 13 American troops died in that explosion. It made for a very powerful moment on stage as they read the names of the 13 service members, noting that Trump, several of them said, Trump kept in touch with them over the course of the last 3 years, and President Biden did not. The parents of one Marine had said that President Biden hasn't even said their son's name publicly. We discussed this on the pod before, but when you look at Biden's approval ratings before August of 2021 and post-August 2021, you start to see a drop following that withdrawal from Kabul, and he still hasn't recovered to those pre-August 2021 levels for the last 3 years. Among the other issues they discussed last night, anti-Semitism. A former Harvard student who's now suing the university for allowing and perpetuating anti-Semitism on campus spoke, riled up the crowd. You also had the parents of one of the 8 Americans being held hostage by Hamas. Remember, there's about 120 hostages still being held in Gaza nearly 10 months later. And that includes 8 Americans. 5 are believed to still be alive. And so you did hear several chants last night from the crowd at the RNC, bring them home, referring to the hostages. They tried to make a point that given the divide within the Democratic Party about the Israel-Gaza war, that you're unlikely to hear something similar at the DNC next month in Chicago. They also tried to personalize former President Trump last night. Don Jr., his son, spoke, as well as former President Trump's granddaughter, Kai. She's 17 years old. She's Don Jr.'s daughter. She tried to humanize the former president as his granddaughter, talking about how he calls her at school. They talk about their golf game and how he boasts about her making honor roll to his friends.
As for what is next at the convention, tonight we'll be hearing from former President Trump himself, and it is expected to be a Trump family affair. Former First Lady Melania Trump is expected to make a rare appearance, as is his daughter, Ivanka Trump, who so far has really stayed out of the political limelight this campaign season. While first ladies typically address the convention, Melania has decided not to speak this year. In fact, she's only been to about 2 campaign events in 2 years.
Yeah, she's kept a very low profile. There are even questions, Jill, as to whether if Trump wins again, whether Melania will actually return to Washington with him and live in the White House, or just continue to live between Bedminster and Mar-a-Lago. So questions there on the First Lady front. When it comes to tonight, though, the big speech we'll be watching is Donald Trump's. He has said in interviews this week since the assassination attempt that he threw away his previous speech, that it was written before the assassination attempt. He was going to be very critical of Democrats, really give it to Joe Biden. And he said that he was planning on rewriting that speech and talking more about unity. And so we'll see if that actually manifested. And what the speech sounds like tonight, whether he doubles down on the party base, whether he tries to, whether he extends a branch to independents, to Nikki Haley voters, potentially to Democrats, how exactly he navigates all of that. And the tone here will be very interesting. First significant address, obviously, since he survived an assassination, since he survived the shooting attempt. So far, body language-wise, for Trump this week, he's appeared more subdued than normal for obvious reasons. And so the question is, how does that translate to now him speaking tonight before a national audience? Likely his largest national audience for a solo speech between now and Election Day, just about 100 days away. There will be likely that second debate in September between him and Joe Biden or whoever the Democratic nominee is. But as far as solo opportunity to address tens of millions of Americans, it's tonight.
We're also learning a bit more about what a potential second Donald Trump term would look like. The former president sat down with Bloomberg Businessweek magazine, where they mainly focused on the economy and foreign policy. A few headlines. He says he would allow Fed Chair Jerome Powell to finish his term, which runs until 2026. He said he's also considering JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon for Treasury Secretary. As for policy, he says he wants to slash the corporate tax rate to as low as 15%, drill for more oil and gas, and regulate less. Now, if one thing stood out from this interview, it's that he is fully aware of his power this time around. And according to Bloomberg, he has every intention of using it.
Yeah, he notes that he hired the wrong people last time, more traditional Republicans. He had no experience in Washington. And a lot of those traditional people either blocked him from doing things, didn't execute his wishes. So he ended up firing a lot of his cabinet. Several posts were fired multiple times. He's admitted he didn't have a great idea of how government worked previously, but this time he'll be going in with a bunch of loyalists who plan to move quickly. He understands how the government functions and how he can navigate things. Of course, he has a number of templates. He has his agenda 47, because he's going to be, well, he hopes to be the 47th president after having been the 45th president. And then, of course, there's Project 2025, put together at the Heritage Foundation by a number of his former staffers. There's connections to his current campaign. And they've laid out a 900-page menu of options for him to pursue in his first several months in office. So there's a lot that could get done quickly. And so if he's elected, the time period between January and June will be telling in terms of how different a Trump 2 is from Trump 1. Jill, one big thing on the economy, he's become very into tariffs. Obviously, he instituted some tariffs against China during his first term, but he's talking about an across-the-board tariff here of 10%, meaning anything coming into this country from another country would have a 10% tariff would have a 10% tariff attached to it, meaning it'd be 10% more expensive. Meaning it would be 10% more expensive for American consumers, but then, of course, the government would get a whole bunch of revenue. He has an idea. He compares himself to William McKinley, who was a president more than a century ago, who had a tariff, not tax idea. Of course, that would lead to larger economic issues. Trump blames other people for that. So he's become very into tariff revenue, not tax revenue. There are a whole bunch of economists, though, who warn that could be very inflationary and could end up effectively becoming a tax on all Americans who have to buy goods. Not all goods are made here. As the economy transitions, some stuff will get made here, some stuff will never get made here. And whether you make $10,000 a year or $10 billion a year, everyone will have to experience the tariff. So it's viewed on a tax it's viewed as a tax that could specifically hit lower income levels because he's looking to lower overall tax levels for the higher income brackets. That's so those are a couple of the headlines on the economy. Another big headline, Taiwan, out of this interview. Trump says in this interview that Taiwan, a democratic island that has lived pseudo-autonomously, not fully independent from China, but effectively independent, though we don't like to call them independent, and neither does China, Trump says that Taiwan should pay the U.S. for its defense against China. Increasingly, it appears that the Chinese are intent on invading Taiwan or using some means to take over Taiwan. Taiwan has effectively lived separately from China as the democratically elected government there 70 plus years ago escaped as the communists took over Beijing. They moved to Taiwan. And so there's a lot of connections between Taiwan and China. China views Taiwan as part of it, but doesn't actually control it territorially. And so the U.S. for years has had this idea of strategic ambiguity, where we will defend Taiwan. It's unclear how we will defend Taiwan, but increasingly we have been selling them a whole bunch of weapons and backing them up. Biden has made explicit in recent years that we would back up Taiwan, especially as it has become clear that China is intent on potentially taking over Taiwan in the coming years. The Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, has set the goal of 2027 for his military to be ready for what would effectively be a D-Day style invasion of Taiwan. They've been doing exercises all around Taiwan in recent years. It's come as the U.S. has been bolstering Taiwan. But now you have Trump saying, well, I don't know if we defend them. They're like 100 miles from China and 9,000 miles away from us. They got to do more for their own defense. Now, Taiwan has been increasing the amount it spends on defense. They've been buying a ton of U.S. weapons. And the Taiwanese response here was that they plan to do more. This could just be Trump effectively negotiating in public. He tends to negotiate by throwing out these threats, which is very different from previous administrations where there's longstanding policy, especially when it comes to allies. And while Taiwan's an ally here, Trump says, maybe you got to do more. Maybe you got to pay more for me to care if China invades you. It's the same strategy we see with NATO, the same strategy we've seen with South Korea, where Trump likes to have these open negotiations, saying you should do more. You should do more for us. Much more transactional and much less based on traditional alliances here. So some nervousness in Taiwan right now. And among the things they're focused on, Trump said, they've eaten our lunch on semiconductors, on the chips that make up our computers, cars, phones. Effectively, 90% of the global chip market is in Taiwan. And so there's been a push in recent years for Taiwanese companies to build here in the U.S. We invented chips originally, but only control about 10% of the global market on chips. So there was the recent CHIPS Act. So there was a recent piece of legislation that Joe Biden passed through called the CHIPS Act that actually it works with the Taiwanese companies to spend billions here in the U.S. Particularly, they're building some plants in Arizona right now. And so an interesting interview. The transcript is available over on the Bloomberg website if you're a subscriber there. But a lot of economic headlines on the agenda here, and the Taiwan headline, particularly notable to allies, not just Taiwan, but across Asia, especially as they increasingly see China as a threat. And Trump here is sort of couching how he would approach that.
And most to the Democratic side now, the push to replace President Biden from the top of the presidential ticket continues. Congressman Adam Schiff of California, one of the highest profile Democrats, is now calling for Biden to drop out of the race. And this is a big deal. Schiff is a longtime supporter of the president and also a close ally of Nancy Pelosi, which means that it is likely that Pelosi gave him the green light to make this statement. Schiff is running for Senate in California and is very likely to be the next senator from the state. He told the Los Angeles Times that Biden is one of the most consequential presidents in our nation's history. He says he would support the Democratic nominee no matter what, but that he doubted Biden can win in November and believed that it would be better for him to step aside in favor of another candidate. At this point, close to 24 House Democrats and 1 Senate Democrat have called on Biden to drop out. But the decision is still Joe Biden's to make. There is one interview that's getting a lot of attention. Biden sat down with BET, asked if there was anything that could make him reevaluate his decision to stay in the race. He said he might do so if, quote, I had some medical condition that emerged. Take a listen to this clip from the interview.
If I had some medical condition that emerged, if the doctors came to me and said, you got this problem, that problem. But I made a serious mistake in the whole debate. And look, when I originally ran, you may remember it, I said I was going to be a transitional candidate. And I thought that I'd be able to move from this to pass it on to someone else. But I didn't anticipate things getting so divided. And quite frankly, I think the only thing age brings is a little bit of wisdom. And I think I've demonstrated that I know how to get things done for the country, in spite of the fact that we told we couldn't get it done. But there's more to do, and I'm reluctant to walk away from that.
So interesting there, mentioning the health issue, and then separately noting that he totally was going to be a 4-year president, transitional figure, but the country was too divided, so he has to stick around.
All right, so some are reading into this that maybe the medical argument, the medical excuse will be his out. But so far, it looks like it is all systems a go for him to stay in the race. Biden had been plowing ahead with his campaign. He had a scheduled campaign stop in Vegas on Wednesday. He wasn't able to make it because his COVID test came back positive. But if anything, he had been picking up his public schedule. He had been adding a bunch of interviews since the debate. But Moshe, what does the timing look like here for Democrats?
Well, now that we had the breaking news on Wednesday of the COVID diagnosis, unclear as we tape this how significant his symptoms are right now. By the way, by my count, Jill, I think this is the 3rd time he's had COVID over the past 4 years. So we'll see what happens there. But the Adam Schiff move, significant here, because a lot of people see effectively Nancy Pelosi orchestrating this from behind the scenes. We talked about this on a couple of the podcasts last week. Nancy Pelosi, former President Obama, are believed to be 2 of the people here involved in trying to get Biden out of the race. So you can expect, after tonight's Trump speech, after everything that, all the focus has been on Republicans for the last week, that there's going to be a lot of pressure on Joe Biden this weekend to hang it up. Will it work? Unclear. But what we do know is the Dems have bought themselves a bit more time. The Democratic National Committee was actually looking next week to virtually nominate Biden and Harris as their ticket. They're going to do it ahead of time, lock them in a month ahead of the convention. Well, they have pushed that back. Why? Well, it's our understanding that among those who said, wait, hit the brakes here, were Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. Chuck Schumer, the top Democrat in the Senate, Hakeem Jeffries, the top Democrat in the House, saying, give it more time. Our caucus leaders, a number of them have major issues and concerns right now. So it appears the Democratic National Committee will at the earliest nominate Joe Biden, the nominee, will nominate Joe Biden on August 7th. That's an important date because Ohio, a key state, has a ballot filing deadline there. And so they believe they need to have the ticket in place on August 7th, more than a week ahead of the scheduled convention in Chicago on August 19th. So August 7th is the next big day. Today is July 18th. How do the next couple of weeks go? Certainly the last 3 weeks have been pretty much 3 of the worst weeks in Joe Biden's political history, between the debate, between Trump win after win. Of course, there was the failed assassination attempt, and now people coming around Trump and the unity and the energy on the Republican side. Now, on top of all of that, Joe Biden has COVID, as he's trying to showcase that, he can be out there and he's strong and he can make the case. He's given a couple interviews and he's tried to plow ahead here, but increasingly there's people within his party who feel confident enough to speak openly here saying, we got trouble. We got major trouble. And it's time to consider someone new on the ticket. And it's not just Democrats in Washington. There's a new AP poll out in the last day that shows that nearly 2/3 of Democrats across the country, Democrats, want Joe Biden out of the race. That is 2/3 of Democrats. Just want to say that one more time. It's not everybody. It's his own party. And there's another poll from Blue Labs Analytics. This is a Democratic firm that's getting a lot of attention. They spoke to 15,000 voters in 7 battleground states, and nearly every Democrat they tested on top of the ticket outperformed the president by 3 points against Donald Trump. That includes Kamala Harris, who runs better than President Biden, but if she was the nominee, she wouldn't do as well as some of these others.
Right. Interestingly, it did ask about other candidates besides Kamala Harris. It looks like what this poll is calling fresh faces did better than Harris or Biden.
Surprise, surprise. Americans don't want to have to make a choice between Biden and Trump or anyone else that they're familiar with. They want a fresh face. So among those that polled better than both Biden and Kamala Harris against Donald Trump are Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, you might know him, former astronaut, husband of Gabby Giffords, Maryland Governor Wes Moore, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. All of them outpaced Biden by 5 points across battleground states. Now, obviously, they're not the candidate. You tend to be the most popular before you get in the race, but still, the latest evidence here that Democrats are going to use to Biden saying, if you care about this party, if what you say, which is, democracy is on the line here when it comes to this election, then put your country over your ambition. And maybe it's time to, turn it over to somebody new. Still think, Jill, that's very unlikely, but things continue to move behind the scenes here that we don't have visibility into. And so it'll be very interesting to see if there is some sort of visit to the White House in the coming days by senior Democrats.
In full masks, I would presume.
Yes, it's 2020 all over again, Jill.
Time for the speed read from CNN. President Biden revealed a series of proposals aimed at lowering housing costs this week as inflation and elevated home prices are shaping up to be decisive issues for voters this year. The plan, which is subject to congressional approval, calls for withdrawing tax credits from landlords who raise rent by more than 5% per year, starting this year and for the next 2 years. The plan would apply only to larger landlords who have more than 50 units in their portfolio, although that does count for more than 20 million rental units across the country, according to the White House. The policy would also include an exception for new construction and buildings that are being substantially renovated. So that's designed to incentivize new rental property construction to increase the supply of apartments and homes for rent. Biden saying, quote, while the prior administration gave special tax breaks to corporate landlords, I am working to lower housing costs for families. Republicans in Congress should join Democrats to pass my plan to lower housing costs for Americans who need relief now.
So first, a reality check on this. This is very much a campaign promise. Unlikely that Congress right now, I would actually call it impossible, would pass such a proposal so close to an election. Dems have a very slim Senate majority. Republicans control the House. There's no way they would support this. And there's even some Democratic critics of this worried about the economic ramifications of setting this sort of limit when it comes to rent increases and the overall impact that could have on the housing market. At the same time, though, he's trying to speak to concerns out there that while inflation is slowing, the cost of housing remains one of the biggest hurdles for a number of Americans. A record high 22 million households spent more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities in recent years. A record 22 million renter households spent 30% or more of their income on rent and utilities back in 2022. That's the last year that we have data for. Presumably, it has gone up with the price of housing going up. And that is significantly more than previous years. So we talked about this last week when the inflation report came out, that shelter inflation, as in the price of buying a home or renting a home. And housing prices have outpaced overall inflation for a couple years now. This is an issue that is very important to a number of voters. Recently, more than a third of Americans cited economic issues as the most important problem facing the country. So you see this promise coming out, Jill. It comes as Bernie Sanders and AOC have been among those who've been in the president's corner in recent weeks, as we've talked about Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, now Adam Schiff, coming out against the president or being critical of the president, either overtly or behind the scenes. The progressives have come to his corner saying he's our guy. Well, at the same time, we now see him picking up a number of issues from them, including setting a cap on rent increases. Jill, I also talked to some developers in the last day, like, how would this work? And they said this could actually make things worse for homeowners. First of all, I'll automatically raise the rent 5% every year because that's all I can raise it. And we have our own costs. And so some of us might not even get in the business some of us might not even continue in the business. And we would be disincentivized to build new projects. And so it could actually have the reverse effect and be bad for consumers if this was to happen. Again, I see this as very unlikely. The Dems would have to have a trifecta. Biden would have to win again. They'd have to keep the Senate and win the House in order for this to even be considered in the next Congress.
From the New York Times, as the planet rapidly warms, train delays and breakdowns are becoming more frequent as America's antiquated rail infrastructure struggles to remain functional during prolonged extreme weather events that were not typical when the system was built. A New York Times analysis of Amtrak data found that the rail service's passengers have faced record delays in recent years caused by inclement weather like heat waves, storms, floods, high winds, low temperatures, tornadoes, lightning, and wildfires. Extreme weather events bogged down Amtrak trains for more than 4,000 hours in the fiscal year of 2023. So that's the highest number of weather-related delays in at least 20 years, and by far the biggest contributor was intensifying heat waves. Heat delays more than doubled from the 2018 fiscal year when Amtrak passengers spent 530 additional hours in trains after high temperatures slowed down rail travel. So what happens is that the railways are made from steel, so they are prone to deformities when exposed to direct sunlight during heat waves. These changes are known as sun kinks, and they happen when the steel overheats and buckles. It creates wobbly and dangerous curves that require railroads to drastically reduce the speed of their trains, and that's in order to avoid derailments. The former director of the Federal Railroad Administration telling the New York Times, "You get a sun kink when the train's on it, you're dead. It is going to go off the rails." Last year, by the way, heat was responsible for nearly 60% of delays that were attributed to a specific weather-related cause.
Jill, this is something you experienced yourself as we were traveling back from D.C. to New York last week.
And it is so extremely frustrating. Even before I got to the station, I got a message saying to expect delays because of the heat. At one point, one of my trains just had to completely stop, and we were starting to smell burned rubber. And it was alarming. Everybody was kind of looking at each other, wondering what was going on. And this happened a few different times during the entire train ride. And I would say we got there about 2 hours, almost 3 hours late. What should be a 3-hour trip, roughly, from New York to Washington, D.C., wound up being almost 5 hours. And I've also faced delays on my way back as well.
Yeah, and we should note U.S. train technology decades behind that of Europe, China, Japan, most of the developed world. And so there's technical solutions that do exist. They just require some investment here. One rail engineer was quoted as saying that you can actually adjust steel tracks for higher temperatures by exposing them to heat before installation. That's a process that allows steel to endure more thermal stress. That's what they do for the rail they lay through the Mojave Desert or Death Valley. But now, as we are experiencing climate change, these record hot summers, it needs to be done elsewhere. What is lacking right now is political will to fund the upgrades here. That'll cost, depending on where you're at, hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars. Last week, House Republicans pushed a bill that would cut funding for rail by $300 million. Last year, Republicans tried to slash Amtrak by 64%. And reduce the money allocated to the Northeast Corridor. That's the most heavily traveled part of the rail. That's the most heavily traveled part of rail, all through blue states between D.C. And Boston. They want to reduce that money by 92%. And so the dilemma here for Amtrak is that Congress wants them to do big things, but they're not willing to fund it. Jill, it comes as we got a headline in the last day that there's a plan that will be rolled out later this summer from folks who want to create a new high-speed rail between New York and Boston that would take only 90 minutes, about 90 to 100 minutes between New York and Boston. It would actually involve a 16-mile tunnel between Long Island and Connecticut. So you'd cut out a lot of the current tracks. Right now it takes about 4 hours to go between New York and Boston. This would take it down to 100 minutes, a high-speed rail line. That'll cost tens of billions of dollars. It's probably unlikely, but there is some money from the infrastructure bill that was passed a couple of years ago for it. So that's something to look out for. But probably something that, if it comes to fruition, is a decade or more away.
From Reuters, Alec Baldwin has informed a New Mexico state prosecutor and sheriff that he may sue them after his case was dismissed last week. It comes after it emerged that prosecutors withheld evidence from his defense team during their botched attempt to prosecute him over a fatal shooting on the movie set for Rust. A New Mexico judge dismissed involuntary manslaughter charges against Baldwin on the third day of the trial on Friday. The judge agreeing with his lawyers that prosecutor Carrie Morrissey and the sheriff's office concealed evidence about the source of the live bullet that killed Rust cinematographer Helena Hutchins back in 2021.
Yeah, it was very emotional. We put up that clip on Instagram over the weekend of Baldwin sobbing, his wife, Ilaria, sobbing, as the judge said, "This is completely unacceptable. I'm dismissing these charges, and you can never be prosecuted for this because of the misconduct we've witnessed here." So it appears Baldwin now going to sue over what took place. He sent letters. His lawyers have sent letters to Morrissey as well as the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office. They're saying, preserve your documents for future litigation here. At the same time, the armorer, her name is Hannah Gutierrez. She was originally found guilty. She's currently serving an 18-month prison sentence. Her lawyers have now filed a motion to dismiss, saying, wait, that evidence was not disclosed to us either. So we'll see what happens with that case. At the same time, you even have some resignations now in the prosecutor's office. The deputy, one of the deputies to the prosecutor, say they weren't even told what was going on in their own office, and that conduct was unacceptable. So they have resigned. So a big mess there in New Mexico, and it appears Baldwin now is going to be pursuing a case against them.
From NPR, the oddest thing about this year's Emmy nominations is that it feels like we just got done talking about last year's awards, and that is because the actors and writers strike pushed the 2023 ceremony back to January of this year. So now let's get to the nominations for 2024. Many were expected. So The Bear set a new record for a comedy in 1 year, getting a whopping 23 nominations. That's 10 more than last year. And the drama Shogun, which airs on FX, landed the most nominations of all this year with 25 total. Still, the Television Academy had a few surprises up its sleeve. The competition for one has opened up a bit. And that's because a lot of shows which used to soak up the Emmy love have either concluded or just weren't eligible this year, like Succession, The Last of Us, Ted Lasso, and The White Lotus. And that has left room for some fresh faces to pop up in the nominations.
Yeah, I have to say, I haven't watched most of these shows, Jill, so I don't know what this is going to mean for Emmy ratings this year. Some of the new names: Reservation Dogs, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Three Body Problem, Fallout, Palm Royal, the Capote versus the Swans, and What We Do in the Shadows All got nominations here in performer and series categories. 36 performers are first-time nominees this year. That includes, by the way, Ryan Gosling, who guest hosted SNL. And then you also saw The Bear clean up in a bunch of categories, including supporting actor. As to the question I got from a few folks, wait, The Bear is a comedy? I don't typically laugh when I watch The Bear. The short answer is they've decided to make it a comedy because they can. You can put your show in whatever category you want. And typically, historically, comedy categories are less competitive than dramas. So the folks at FX decided to put The Bear as a comedy, not necessarily because it's funny, because they can.
So that's the trick here, Mo. Should we be submitting the Mo News podcast under like the comedy character category for podcasts?
We do have laughs once in a while, Jill. I don't know how much we'd win in the comedy category, though. But a strategic play here when it comes to Emmy nominations. So a little behind the scenes there for you. As far as other noms, Apple TV's The Morning Show nabbed 4 of 7 total nominations. Nabbed a whole number of nominations, including Best Supporting Actress and several cast members for Supporting Actor. You also saw The Bear, Abbott Elementary, Hacks, and Only Murders in the Building, where a number of members of their core cast all nominated for major awards.
And from The Guardian, Adele has announced that she intends to go on hiatus from music after a forthcoming concert residency in Munich. The British singer telling the German broadcaster ZDF, quote, "My tank is quite empty from being on stage every weekend in Las Vegas. I don't have any plans for new music at all. I want a big break after this, and I think I want to do other creative things just for a little while." Adele has been performing her Weekends with Adele concert residency at Caesars Palace since November of 2022. It concludes on November 23rd. And prior to the final Vegas shows, she is spending the summer in Munich, where she's going to be playing 2 concerts a week for 5 weeks in a stadium built just for her. 95% of the tickets have already been sold.
So you could say, Jill, that she's going to be saying hello from the other side. Would that be fair?
Fair. And I don't know how to say hello in German, or else I would. And I feel like you're looking it up as we speak.
I'm looking it up because most people, whenever I was in Germany, they say "allo," like "allo from the other side."
So that's what she's going to be saying.
So the more formal would be like "Guten Tag" or "Guten Morgen," right? Good morning, Guten Tag.
You're the linguist, Moshe.
Listen, I think we have Babbel as a sponsor, so
yes.
If people are looking to brush up on their German, one of the more complicated languages out there, we have a special deal for you if you listen to the ads earlier. As far as Adele is concerned, now that she's left Vegas for Germany, she's expecting a quieter audience. Americans, she says, can be very, very loud, so she's expecting a more chill.
What do you mean, Adele?
Apparently, it's going to be a more chill vibe at Adele shows in Munich. Weekends with Adele. Jill, we'll wait to see what she has in store for us. Her most recent album still is 30, which is the album she put out back in November of 2021.
And she has insisted on naming her albums, Moshe, after her age, which I don't know. Does that age well as she gets older? I don't know.
Well, she's currently 36, Jill. So maybe she'll have one for 37. But probably if she's going to be taking a break for a while, she might have a 3 in front of the next album. We'll see what she has in store for us. Definitely not the pace of a Taylor Swift, you could say.
Look, the big 4-0 would certainly be, I hope it's not that far off, but That would be a good year.
All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1925. The first volume of Mein Kampf, the political manifesto written by Adolf Hitler that became the Bible for Nazism in Germany, was published on this day 99 years ago. He first started conceiving of it during a prison sentence he served after World War I, focused on grievances, blaming the Jews for all the faults in Germany. It effectively became his blueprint for the Third Reich. And we should note, it wasn't very popular when it first came out. He sold less than 10,000 copies in his first year. Later, when he becomes the dictator of Germany, it was given out to all individuals. All right, fast forward to 1940 on this day. As we talk about conventions right now, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, was nominated for a 3rd presidential term at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. He was the first U.S. president and only U.S. president to be nominated for a 3rd consecutive term. George Washington, remember, our first president, had served 2 terms, declined to run for a 3rd term. That was the tradition. Well, FDR decided he needed to, that he had a duty to continue serving as the crisis mounted in Europe, the beginning of the Nazi invasion there. And so he would go for it and win that third nomination. In fact, he would then win a fourth nomination. And then following his death in 1947, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, which stated that no person could be elected to the office more than twice. All right. In other presidential history, on this date in 1995, 29 years ago today, Dreams from My Father, a story of race and inheritance, a memoir from a little-known 34-year-old law professor named Barack Obama is published. He wrote the book before entering politics. 13 years after it was published, he was elected America's 44th president. Jill, oftentimes when you're running for higher office, especially when you're running for president, you put out a book about your life. Typically not that interesting. Dreams from My Father, though, probably one of the best-selling books a candidate for president has ever written. I'd put it up there with Profiles in Courage, right? JFK's book. All right, let's end here with some pop culture history. On this day, 36 years ago, the Beach Boys released Kokomo, naming all of your favorite existing islands and some made-up ones, Jill.
Yes, some that they needed just to rhyme.
For the most part, I'll give them credit. The majority of them real: Aruba, Jamaica, Bermuda, Key Largo. But of course, Kokomo is made up for the song. And for simplicity, instead of calling it the Bahamas, they call it Bahama. They made it singular, for the music.
Well, you've got to rhyme with Pretty Mama, so.
Well, you got to back into the rhyme. There you go. And then finally, in TV history, I remember when this was the hit show. 20 years ago today, Entourage premiered on HBO. We meet Vinny Chase, Drama Turtle, Ari Gold, the whole crew.
All right, Moshe, that is a wrap. We want to thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
See you guys tomorrow.